The Practitioners of Musick offer a program that reflects both mid to late 17th and 18th century Dutch music of the sort that likely was or could be heard in the territory of New Netherlands and its capital, New Amsterdam, located on the tip of Manhattan Island, and after 1664, when the English captured the city, renaming it New York. In August 1673, the city of New York was recaptured by the Dutch Navy and renamed New Orange. For a little over a year, the city remained in Dutch hands before reverting to English rule in 1674 and becoming New York again. Honoring the younger brother of Charles II, James, Duke of York, who later reigned as James II, adding the former Dutch colony to its expanding British North American territory. Household inventories in New Netherlands occasionally list various musical instruments such as lutes and fluiten or recorders, and serve as testimony to a vibrant high and low musical culture. Such instruments were also heard in taverns, public houses, in more domestic settings. Music making was a collaborative endeavor, drawing together player and listener alike, and was thought to contribute to the felicity of social harmony. Dutch popular instrumental repertory heard will be drawn from such diverse collections as Telt Niemand Cabinet or Boerenliedjes or farmer songs, some with melody origins in Britain, reflecting in some measure the multitude and influence of the cultural exchanges between the Netherlands and England during the reign of King William III and Queen Mary II. William was of the Dutch House of Orange-Nassau, and Mary Stuart, eldest daughter of James II, who was also William's cousin. Both monarchs jointly resided in grand palaces, Hampton Court in England, Paleis et Loo in the Netherlands. In these respective places, music had a significant ceremonial and social role. Certainly prosaic in comparison to majestic residence, but no less important among Dutch homesteads in New Jersey, is the historically significant Staats family house, dating from the mid-18th century, that also figures prominently during the American War of Independence. The surname Staats translates as nation, and also translates from the archaic Dutch as splendor. Abraham Staats and his wife, Margaret Dubois, as depicted by Micah Williams, traveling portrait artist who worked principally in the medium of pastel that enabled him to execute likenesses of New Jersey's well-to-do middle class, quickly and inexpensively. A New Jersey resident, he traveled principally in Monmouth County, but also established himself with clientele in the Raritan Valley area. Williams is, in a sense, an heir, so to speak, of the tradition of portrait painting activities of earlier Dutch artists of New Netherlands and New Amsterdam, as well as early itinerant British school limners. During the lifetime of American patriot Abraham Staats, the house served as the temporary headquarters for Major General Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. The Baron was a Prussian military officer who played a leading role during the war by reforming George Washington's Continental Army into a disciplined and professional fighting force. Acknowledging New Jersey as the crossroads of the American Revolution, a march composed in his honor will be performed. New Netherland was established as the first Dutch colony in North America, stretching from the present-day Connecticut River, encompassing northeastern and central New Jersey. It extended from such nascent communities as Beverwijk, today Albany, New York, in the north, reaching to New Amstel, today Newcastle, Delaware, in the south. The Dutch claimed to this territory a large swath of mid-Atlantic coast of North America, derived from their sponsorship of Henry Hudson's voyages of exploration, and were part of a great race for wealth, knowledge, and strategic advantage among European rivals, notably the powerful Spanish and Portuguese viceroyalties, which had pioneered sea exploration and dominated the lucrative trade with Asia. In April 1609, Hudson and his crew sailed in the ship De Halve Maan, or Half Moon. 5 months later, Hudson and his crew became the first Europeans to sail up the river that today bears his surname. Although Hudson failed to find a route through or around North America to the Pacific, following his 1609 nautical journey to the west, he described upon his return to the Dutch Republic what he had found, a magnificent harbor, wide navigable rivers, and a land rich in natural resources, and an abundance of fur-bearing animals. After Hudson's report of what he had observed was made public, merchants and investors throughout the Netherlands proper started sponsoring speculative voyages to the new colony, planting the seeds of a small outpost that would become one of the most important cities in world history, and how that outpost, operating under the wing of the leading city of the Dutch Republic, came to exhibit a common spirit with the American city it would become. The original stewards of this natural bounty, various native tribal societies, and most particularly the Lenape, who called their principal land holding Mannahatta, meaning hilly island. The Lenape, meaning the people, spoke an Algonquian language. Mannahatta seemingly had a surfeit of fruit, nuts, birds, and animals. Fish and shellfish were plentiful from the ocean. The new land was, however, in contrast with the motherland, for in the new land there were native people, forests to be turned into fields, and vast distances to be traversed. The motherland, Holland, was densely settled, highly urbanized, and prosperous, and was itself still very new. It shared with its colony across the ocean a spirit of transformation, of social openness, toleration, and rapid economic growth, offering golden opportunities to those willing to take risks. In 1621, the Dutch governing Staten-Generaal, or States General, chartered the West India Company and granted a monopoly on fur trade in the New Netherlands with the goal of bringing order to economic activity. The first wave of colonists arrived in 1624. A year later, a second stronghold, Fort New Amsterdam, was established on the southern tip of Manhattan Island to receive incoming ships and protect the entrance to the river, in turn becoming an economic and cultural hub. The lucrative possibilities of New Netherland, founded as a place to do business operated by the Dutch West India Company, attracted considerable interest during the era known as the Gouden Eeuw, or Golden Age, with the independent United Provinces of the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic, became Europe's leading commercial power and Amsterdam its preeminent trading city. By 1670, Amsterdam was the third largest city in Europe. In turn, New Amsterdam became a major business center in its own right until the WIC gave up its trade monopoly and allowed residents to engage in trade on their own behalf. This is well examined in Russell Shorto's The Island at the Center of the World, Simon Schama's Embarrassment of Riches, and Jonathan Israel's Rise of the Dutch Republic. It has been said that in 1626 the Lenape sold Mannahatta to Peter Minuet of the Dutch settlement for the equivalent of 60 guilders worth of trade goods, and on this topic much ink has been spilt. To put this in further perspective in terms of equivalency, I'm grateful to Conservator Curator Imara Limon of the Amsterdam Museum. In the mid-17th century, a beaver skin cost about 7 guilders. Colonists arrived in New Netherland from all over Europe as it socially, politically, and economically offered a strategic point for trade and lucrative investment, many having fled religious persecution and war. The Peace of Munster in 1648 signaled the end of 80 years of war when Spain retained the southern Netherlands, today Belgium, and recognized the Dutch Republic as an independent country. Doing business in New Netherland for Dutch traders meant dealing with the Native Americans, especially in the early years when the focus was in fact on the fur trade. This opened the door for profitable trade in beaver pelt in exchange for axes, glass beads, and other items, even adapting to the use of wampum known as siwant, eventually edging out from the fur trade the Lenape, who had originally managed the hunting and trapping of the beaver population. Initially, beaver pelts purchased from local indigenous Lenape native peoples were the colony's primary source of wealth. In Europe, these pelts were used to produce highly fashionable men's hats as seen in Rembrandt van Rijn's portrait of a nobleman, circa 1637, wearing a beaver hat. The Lenape fur trade ended because the beaver were hunted to near extinction by colonists. Added to the social dynamic, disease caused death among the Lenape, brought by Europeans because their bodies hadn't developed any immunity or resistance to them. Another blow for the indigenous peoples, being forced to withdraw from their sacred lands, displaced by Europeans. Over time, beginning in the 1640s, the Dutch colony's economy broadened and diversified. Eventually, cultivation and export of tobacco became important as the fur trade. New Netherlands became a fulcrum of trade between New England and the Caribbean, building upon the now notorious triangular trade: slaves, sugar, molasses, rum. Slave labor was instrumental in the rise of New Amsterdam and New Nederland. The first African slaves arrived in 1624 and were used as laborers on farms and to construct Fort Amsterdam. They were owned by the West India Company, again the WIC, which was responsible for bringing them to the Dutch colony. Life in New Amsterdam and New Netherland developed into a culturally diverse and politically robust settlement. This diversity was fostered by Dutch respect for freedom of conscience. Towns within New Netherland were granted the protections and privileges of self-government. Dutch success produced many competitors, the English chief amongst them. Between 1652 and 1674, the two nations fought 3 wars. As a consequence of these wars, New Netherland came under British control, and despite this transfer of power, but not without leaving a lasting imprint. A complicated relationship between the city's Dutch and English residents ensued in the years following the initial English takeover. Dutch colonists integrated themselves in English society, and yet strong Dutch roots of material culture, architecture, and customs persisted. Its roots had already been established through the language, diversity, culture, foods, place names such as Haarlem, Brooklyn, Broadway, Breedeweg, anglicized from Nederlands, and business practices that are still evident in New York City today as a multicultural center of trade. The concept of a stock exchange was initiated by the Dutch with the formation in Amsterdam of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, in 1602, the first publicly traded company. Dutch influence remained firm in the former New Netherland, New Amsterdam, throughout the late 17th century and well into the 18th century during the American War of Independence. Prominent among the Dutch families settling in the colony in the mid-17th century was the Beekman family, with links to the Staats. The Beekman House in New York figures prominently during the war when Washington paid his respects to the Beekman family, attending social events at the Grand House, Mount Pleasant, a place of elegance and refinement. John Adams served as the first minister plenipotentiary or American ambassador to Holland in 1782. In the same year came formal recognition by the Netherlands of the United States as a separate and independent nation. In fact, the first country to establish diplomatic relations with the new United States was Holland. Early Dutch American colonists participated in a complex overseas trade network of goods and humans and were dependent on a vast transatlantic mercantile system for manufactured wares. Many everyday objects were imported from abroad. In exchange for manufactured items, colonists traded animal furs, later tobacco, as well as raw materials such as lumber and pig iron. There were iron forges throughout the Hudson River Valley as well as iron forges in New Jersey. Indeed, globalization is not a recent phenomenon. Even in the 17th century, typical colonists' worldly goods came from all over the globe. Examples of household objects that could be found in the middling house to the well-to-do homes included pewter plates, bowls, beakers, ceramics, figurative Dutch Delft tiles used primarily as fireplace surrounds, blown glass, metal, brass, and silver. For the Dutch in early America, merchandise made on the European continent and luxury items from Asia were central to daily life and are oft listed in elite household inventories. We know this because Dutch colonists and their descendants took good care of these possessions and passed them along to family members after death. The household inventory of well-to-do Abraham Staats is an important document of social and cultural history and reflects earlier Dutch American documentation. Staats owned carpets, looking glasses, tea china, and various items of silver. Many items in Dutch colonial households served multiple purposes. A prominent piece of furniture in Dutch colonial household settings were large cupboards called kas or kast. There's one in the Staats House, for instance, often monumental in scale with 2 doors and broad overhanging cornices and paneling similar to architectural interiors. Clothing, bedding, and table linens were folded on shelves and regularly retrieved from the kast according to household routines. Dutch settlers often decorated their walls with maps, prints, and paintings, things to remind them of their former home in Europe. Portraits were emblematic of family pride and station in society. There were artists working in the Dutch colonial regions, and colonists commissioned purchased a growing number of paintings by local self-taught artists of both Dutch and English descent, such as Gerrit Dalkink. Dalkink was a member of one of the most important families of Dutch artists, working in New York in the 17th century. As a youth, he assisted his father Evert, an established glazier working in New Amsterdam, but by 1679 identified himself as a schilder, or painter. Despite this claim of creative status, Dalkink did not sign or date his portraits and often based his compositions on British print sources. This portrait, A Lady with Rose, relates stylistically to documented works by Peter van der Len, an artist born in Holland who was active in the Hudson River Valley region. While the sitter displays a solemn expression, she wears, for the time, circa 1730, fashionable clothing and jewelry, and holds a single rose in her right hand, a gesture signifying or emblematic of love and marriage. This lively scene of a hunting party in New Jersey by an unknown artist was most likely based on a British print source. It conveys the wealth and grandeur of country house ownership that the sport represented, and to which many colonists aspired. The painting once hung in the 18th century house of the Van Horn family of Communipaw, now Jersey City, New Jersey. Members of the extended colonial Dutch Van Horn family resided in a house built in 1754 in Bridgewater. During the Revolutionary War, that house served as headquarters on 2 different occasions for Washington's senior officers, General Benjamin Lincoln first, and secondly, General William Alexander, fashioned Lord Stirling. Geraldus Dalkink, son of Gerrit Dalkink, specialized in portraits and biblical scenes or scripture history paintings that were popular among Protestant patrons living in New York's Dutch settlements in the Hudson River Valley and Raritan River Valley, where the influence of the Dutch Reformed Church was strong. Often based on contemporary print sources, religious paintings such as this were typically displayed in the dwelling room, where family members could contemplate their moral lessons. In most houses, you would also find a Bible and sometimes other books, and this is indeed true in surveying the Staats House inventory. One inventory in particular is especially salient, found in archival collections of the Albany County, New York Hall of Records. In Beverwijk, or Beaver Town, Jan Gerrits van Marken, a Dutchman who emigrated in 1654, first to New Amstel and later Beverwijk, is listed in 1662 as a farmer of the excise, or duty. He was a collector of taxes levied on consumable alcoholic beverages. In 1664, he made an inventory of his possessions that included sundry items of clothing, household linens, children's caps, and gloves, and a pair of children's stockings. Goods which hang loose about the house, such as looking glasses, books, pictures, and houtflauten, wooden recorders, presumably made in Holland. One of the most important sources of mid-17th century Dutch music is Jacob van Eyck's Der Flauten Lusthof, or Flute's Pleasure Garden, designated for either handfluit, descant, or soprano recorder. Van Eyck's volume includes variation sets on popular secular melodies, Dutch in origin, or from French, English, German, and Italian sources of repertory. There are also psalm tune settings included as well. Picking up on the subject of Van Marken, recorders, and alcohol, there is a reference of interest included in Jannie Venema's of the New Netherlands project, her study, Beverwijk, a Dutch village on the American frontier. From Beverwijk document dated December 1660, a man by the name of Klaus Marschall left the alehouse of Peter Bronco one Sunday evening, befuddled, but in good humor, with a big flute in his pocket. The taverns were vibrant centers of social life in both the Netherlands and New Netherlands throughout. The Dutch colonial tavern was an important place where news was exchanged, a convivial place where people drank and smoked. Drinking was a key component of business transactions in Dutch life. A business agreement usually would not be considered complete without the two parties having a drink to make the deal official. Notice this detail of the Jan Steen painting. In addition to the aforementioned pursuits, entertainment with musical instruments was possible, as taverns usually had instruments available for patrons to play. Again, notice in this detail of Jan Steen's painting of a tavern scene, note the cittern and the viol hanging on the paneled wall. Individuals from all social strata, classes frequented the tavern. For example, the tavern keepers of New Netherlands not only did business with the colonists, but also to the local indigenous or First Peoples. The government of the colony regulated the taverns and the amounts of alcohol that could be sold to colonists and indigenous peoples. The government also regulated or limited the amount of gambling that took place at the tavern. As in the visual arts for the home, again evidenced in household inventories in Amsterdam and New Amsterdam, there were consumers for printed music and musical instruments, keyboard, string, woodwinds, and as such were wealthy individuals. Calvinist cultural policy allowed music only a modest role. Public musical life following the Reformation was confined to performances by licensed town musicians and to carillon and organ recitals. The numerous 17th century Dutch paintings and drawings that exist portraying and picturing musical groups vividly show the vitality of domestic musical life. The repertoire was largely instrumental, works for lute, recorder, violin, viola da gamba, harpsichord, and chamber organ, but primarily vocal, featuring both sacred and secular lyrics in songbooks called liedboeken. Liedboeken were printed both with music or with just the text, because only people trained in music could read notes. In many instances, the name of the tune would be referenced, and these tended to be popular melodies already in current usage. In the youth culture of the day, young men sang liedeken for their beloved. Texts in the form of broadside ballads were sold on the street during market days. It is likely that various iterations of these publications, widely available in Holland, circulated in Dutch America. In reaction to this, poetic ministers of the Dutch Reformed Church produced booklets with a more moralistic theme. Then there were vocal works with elegant text of renowned poets such as Gerbrand Bredero, Constantin Huygens, and Jos van de Vendel, set to original melodies or to existing tunes from France, England, and Italy, as well as Holland. Many of these songs have direct and intense lyrics, sacred, political, and amorous. Volumes of Bornleitjes farmer songs published throughout the 18th century present a good idea of the instrumental music that was heard during domestic performances in Holland and, by extension, New Netherlands. Music that would have resonated with the Staats family and their contemporaries. Popular music extolling the tenacity of the Dutch in revolt against the oppression of Spain continued to remain in circulation. The most important source is poet Adriaan Valerius, whose Nederlands Gedenkklank was devoted to patriotic texts and melodies. Some of these tunes are in current use and thus well known today. Wilhelmus van Nassau melody is the national anthem of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Another good example is He wilde den Vield, a patriotic text, but the music now linked to the observance of Thanksgiving, with the familiar text opening with, "We gather together." It so happened that one of the earliest inhabitants of New Amsterdam associated with the Dutch West India Company was the successful merchant and poet Jacob Steendam, who from his house on Pearl Street walked the streets of the port town and listened to the sounds rising forth from the many taverns, other public places, and in the home. As in old Amsterdam, weddings and parties were not complete without instrumental music and rousing songs, and Steendam supplied a good number of them, bearing witness to daily life in colonial Dutch Manhattan. Before the appellation as the first poet of New Amsterdam, Steendam published in Holland a triple volume of poetry under the title Den Distelvink, or The Goldfinch. During his years in Manhattan, he was inspired to write a great deal about life in the new colonies, and a good example being the poem In Praise of New Netherland. In this composition, he waxed lyrical about the riches to be found in the sea and on land, and the good living to be had in the region between the Delaware and Connecticut rivers, territory settled by the Staats family. From In Praise of New Netherland, "You poor who know not how your living to obtain, you affluent who seek in mind to be content, choose you New Netherland, which no one shall disdain, before you time and strength here fruitlessly are spent. The birds obscure the sky so numerous in their flight, the animals roam wild and flatten down the ground, the fish swarm in waters and exclude the light. The oysters there, than which none better can be found, are piled up heap on heap till islands they attain, and vegetation clothes the forest mean and plain." We opened the Dutch portion of our program with Wilhelmus van Nassau, the opening line of the verse, "William of Nassau, scion of a Dutch and ancient line, I dedicate undying faith to this land of mine." From Nederlands Gedenkklank, He wilde den Vield, a popular melody in 17th century Holland that was set to a patriotic text, which begins, "Please stand before Lord God." We know the melody as "We gather together." Petit Branden from Talmud Cabinet by Paulus Matthijs. Reminding our viewers, Der Flautenlusthof, or the Flute's Pleasure Garden, or Garden of Delights, is a multi-volume collection of music for recorder by Jacob van Eyck. It is the largest collection of music for a single wind instrument ever published by a single composer during the Baroque period. It was first published in 1644 with further editions in 1646, 49, 54, and 56. The pieces include, as mentioned before, folk songs from various sources in Europe, dance tunes, church works, psalms, and songs of the day, including material adapted from Van Eyck's own carillon music. Although written for amateur players, the standard of musicianship in Holland was clearly of a high order, as the pieces are considered challenging by modern standards. will now play a selection of Bauernliedjes, or farmers' dances and songs. Returning to the Dutch-English presence in New Jersey, and specifically the Raritan River Basin, a region home to, among other historic houses, the Staats House. The Raritan and Millstone River valleys comprise one of the earliest, most extensive, and perhaps the most prosperous center for European development in the provinces of the two Jerseys. Settled in the years 1665 through 1685, following the bloodless British conquest of New Netherlands, the area's ethnic diversity was pronounced, with competition among Dutch, English, and Scots speakers, and their affiliations with Dutch Reformed, Anglican, and Presbyterian churches, respectively. Church historians have referred to the river valleys as a garden for the Dutch Reformed Church. Two of America's oldest counties are located in New Jersey: Middlesex, founded in 1683, and Somerset, founded in 1688. Dutch settlers also brought to fruition in the region one of the few chartered colonial colleges. The initial impetus for this educational enterprise was the result of discussions that took place in the old Dutch parsonage, the residence of Dutch Reformed Church ministers in modern-day Somerville, leading to a royal charter facilitated by William Franklin, illegitimate son of Benjamin Franklin, and the last royal governor of New Jersey. Located in New Brunswick, on a bluff overlooking the Raritan River and just up the King's Highway from Princetown and the College of New Jersey, it was originally known as Queen's College, founded in 1766 in honor of Queen Charlotte, consort of George III of England. The Queen, an accomplished bibliophile, an ardent lover of music, she sang and played the harpsichord, was dedicated to the advancement of learning. Today, the former college is known as Rutgers University after Colonel Henry Rutgers, a Revolutionary War hero, son of colonists from the Netherlands, and a major benefactor bearing witness to yet another Dutch proper surname. The Raritan River was a major artery for goods and services to and from New Brunswick, originally settled by the Dutch in 1681, and the port of Perth Amboy, settled by the Scots in 1683. Both important river communities boasted taverns and assembly rooms for music and dance. In this view of Perth Amboy, the conjoined name of the city in honor of an early proprietor of East Jersey, James Drummond, for 4th Earl of Perth, in turn drawn from the Perth River area in Scotland, and the Lenape word name for place resembling a bowl. Perth Amboy is also sited across the waterway from the Dutch-settled Staten Island. As mentioned, Perth Amboy, as the Scottish settlement in North America, is also the location of the only surviving royal governor's mansion in colonial America, the Proprietary House, in honor of the Scots settlement, the Scots Ground, from Robert Bremner's Spinet or Harpsichord Miscellany. Along the Raritan River in the northeastern corner of Somerset County, Bound Brook was first settled in the late 1600s. This Staats House, with extensive farmland located in what is South Bound Brook today, benefited from the region's network of waterways, essentially commercial arteries. By the time of the American Revolution, this house was already 3 decades old. The original structure, 2 rooms and a garret, was built about 1740 on 305 acres owned by the Staats. A prominent Dutch colonial family, as we've learned. They occupied the home for 2 centuries, expanding it to its current form. The framework of this house demonstrates the continued reliance well into the 18th century on traditional Netherlandish building practices in communities settled by Dutch immigrants in the Hudson River Valley and the central New Jersey Raritan River area. Dutch frame houses were constructed with a series of post and beam supports. Abraham Staats, in addition to working his land, was a tax collector, held other civic responsibilities, and he was a surveyor, a skill he shared with George Washington. From his surviving household inventory, he owned enslaved blacks, Africans, something he also shared in common with Washington. The blacks, the enslaved blacks, who had survived the Middle Passage when many slaves died, a 6-week journey across the Atlantic Ocean in the cramped and unsanitary cargo holds of ships. Abraham Staats and his family lived here during the American Revolution. He was such an ardent patriot that the British excluded him from a general amnesty offered to rebellious Americans. The region's role in the American War of Independence has earned it the designation the cockpit of and the crossroads of the American Revolution, national and state heritage area. The Staats House is yet another crucial link between Revolutionary War heritage areas and the historical parks that stretch from the Hudson River Valley, crisscrossing New Jersey in particular, thence into Bucks County, Philadelphia, and Valley Forge. The upper Raritan Valley was then a sparsely settled, primarily agricultural region inhabited largely by descendants of Dutch settlers. Many spoke little English and had no real loyalty to the English crown. British and Hessian auxiliary troops under General Charles Cornwallis, the first Marquis of Cornwallis, were garrisoned in New Brunswick between January and June of 1777. Skirmishes were fought up and down the Raritan Valley. When Washington eluded Cornwallis, the British withdrew from the Raritan Valley to attack Philadelphia. Washington once again chose the area of Middlebrook for a second encampment. The second Middlebrook encampment of 1778-1779 features prominently in a series of important military, strategic, and social events. There are a number of historic houses with ties to the richly documented historical Dutch Anglo presence in the region that served as headquarters for George Washington and several of his generals during the encampment. All indeed still exist, and all can be visited. Today they offer a unique historical perspective on the nature of military encampments during the Revolutionary War. Among them, the Wallace House, the Vanderveer House, and the Staats House. The Wallace House near the Raritan River, also in modern-day Somerville, was the headquarters of General Washington. This house, a fine 8-room Georgian mansion, was on a large property known as Hope Farm, developed by John Wallace, a prominent and retired Philadelphia merchant. Washington, joined by his wife Martha, rented 4 of the rooms, sharing the home with the Wallaces. Also at Washington's headquarters was his dedicated black valet, William Billy Lee, as well as staff attending to cooking and housekeeping, the commander-in-chief's guard of 144 troops, and aides-de-camp kept busy with the voluminous correspondence needed to manage Army operation. Washington also hosted and entertained dignitaries. From his youth, Washington was preoccupied with civilized behavior. He recognized the value of a solid reputation, good manners, education, and proper attire. During a lifetime filled with formal balls, fancy dinners, public gatherings, hunting parties, and lively debates, he would write, "Nothing is more agreeable and ornamental than good music," from General Orders, 4th June, 1777. The Jacobus van der Veer House in Bedminster, Pluckeman, was built in a typical style as favored by prosperous Dutch settlers. The house served as the base for Brigadier General Henry Knox, who had impressed General Washington with his knowledge of artillery and other ordnance and was appointed artillery commander. Knox supervised and laid out and had constructed during the winter of 1778-79 a large building at Pluckeman, the location of the Continental Army Artillery, with a large central structure, essentially the nation's first military academy, that was used for training and as an assembly hall for social activities, especially welcome in the winter months, attended by Washington, his senior officers, and their wives. A very famous dance event, the French Alliance Ball and Assembly, took place in this very space. Dr. James Thatcher, surgeon in the American Army, effectively an eyewitness, reported that there was not a night without amusement and dancing. On February 18, 1779, General Knox and his officers hosted a grand ball, and everyone allowed it was the first of its kind in the state. We danced all night. The illuminating fireworks were more than pretty. It was to celebrate the alliance between France and America. Cannons were discharged. There was an elegant dinner, and the celebration ended with a splendid ball, opened by His Excellency General Washington, having for his partner the lady of General Knox. General Knox's lady was Lucy Flucker Knox, whom he married in 1774. Unlike Henry Knox, who was self-made and largely self-educated, eventually the proprietor of a bookstore in Boston, Lucy Flucker, in contrast to Knox, was among Boston's political and financial elite, at the apex of pre-revolutionary Boston society, and the daughter of the Royal Provincial Secretary Thomas Flucker. With the outbreak of hostilities in 1775, her family remained ardently loyalist. The Knoxes escaped, decamped through the British line. As Washington danced a minuet with Lucy Knox, he inspired the following tribute, again from the quill of Dr. Thatcher. The ball was opened by His Excellency the General. When this man unbends from his station and its weighty functions, he is even then like a philosopher, who mixes with the amusements of the world, that he may teach it what is right, or turn trifles into instruction. Other social dances, such as the marionette's cotillion on a French model, essentially a square dance, were popular. In addition, English country dances delighted couples with complex choreography or figures. One happy convergence is the country dance, A Trip to Pluckeman, set to a melody that survives in several tune collections by John Hywell, Inspector of Music for the American Army. During the Second Middlebrook encampment, the Staats hosted another one of Washington's key generals, Baron von Steuben, from March 26 to June 19, 1779. As a young Prussian officer, he had been attached to the general staff of Frederick the Great and served with distinction in the 7 Years' War in Europe, or as called in America, the French and Indian War, a war Washington knew firsthand. In the years following the 1763 Treaty of Paris ending the First Global War, in order to support himself and seeking debt relief, engaged in a search for positions in the British, French, and Austrian armies to no avail. By the summer of 1777, he was in France, where he hoped riches could be earned in the American War for Independence. While in France and in Paris, he met Dr. Franklin, the most famous man in the world, who was petitioning the French monarchy to support the American cause. While Franklin could not offer rank or pay, von Steuben, with no other prospect, decided to pursue fighting for the American cause. Franklin, writing to Washington, recommended Steuben to be placed in charge of training the raw troops. As an appointed major general and with a solid experience of European military tactics, he was commissioned to mold the troops into an effective fighting force. Steuben formed a model drill company of 100 men, transforming it into a precision unit, then copied throughout the ranks, providing much welcome inspiration for the entire army, all detailed meticulously in a training manual called the Blue Book, containing, as stated, regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States. By late spring 1779, his standard method for systematic drilling and preparation of the soldiers was evident, and Washington showcased select units, model companies, during a grand review. When the encampment broke in June, Washington's army was better trained than ever before, thanks to the efforts of von Steuben. And from this turning point until the end of the war, the improved Continental Army maintained a level of discipline that could be considered comparable to that of British regulars, with their centuries-old tradition. Von Steuben was present in the final campaign at Yorktown, resulting in the American victory of the Revolutionary War, and became an American citizen when the Revolutionary War was over. One of Washington's last official acts as wartime commander was to write a letter to von Steuben commending his service.